I do want to introduce to you Nancy Carlisle, who will be talking about the Cherished Possessions exhibit. And Nancy is Curator of Collections for SPNEA. She's been there since 1987. And she has done curatorial work at the Atwater Kent Museum in Philadelphia and the Essex Institute in Salem, Massachusetts. And at SPNEA, she has served as curator of Newbury Furniture and as co-curator of A Walk Through Time and A Passion for the Past. And just as a note, to prepare for the Cherished Possessions exhibit, which is traveling around the country and is really marvelous, she spent 3 years compiling information, rediscovering objects in SPNEA's collection, which is very large. And the exhibit, again, will be traveling throughout the country, including, I think, Hawaii, right? Yeah, all the way to Hawaii as well. And Nancy Carlisle feels that Cherished Possessions offers a new way of looking at objects traditionally considered decorative arts. The exhibition presents these objects to the viewer as introduction to people's lives. And today you're going to hear about some of these stories. So please help me welcome Nancy Carlisle. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I look forward to telling you about a few of these treasures. SPNEA has 100,000 plus objects and 400,000 plus photographs and plenty of things to choose from. So culling them down to a manageable 200, which were the number that are traveling in the exhibition, was a challenge and a joy. Let me just start the slide. For those of you who don't know SPNEA, we are a regional preservation organization. We own 25 historic house museums that range from houses like this one in York, Maine, which was an 18th century house, which still contains many of the furnishings which were in it in the 18th century, and range all the way up to the 20th century to the Walter Gropius house. This is an iconic modernist house that belonged to the Bauhaus architect Walter Gropius in Lincoln, Massachusetts, and also retains its original furnishings. Many of them came out of the Bauhaus workshop, including these tubular steel tables, which are by Marcel Breuer, which were used in Germany before they were brought over here, and the long chair that you see with the sheepskin on it, which was also designed by Breuer and developed for the Isokon company in England. With the contents of 25 historic museums, SPNEA's substantial collections are considered the most important in the nation for the study of New England material life. The opportunity to show some of the highlights of the collections was one that we couldn't pass up. This is the installation as the show was seen at Colby College in Maine, where it's just closed. But basically, the exhibition takes a different approach to traditional decorative arts in that rather than focusing on color and form and craft practices, we focus instead on the stories of the people who owned these pieces and use them as an opportunity to really elucidate or to approach what is more of a subtle nuance about the history and culture of New England. And taken together, these 200 objects remind me of John Donne's poem, No Man is an Island, because in fact, just 200 simple objects take you all over the world and to people rich and poor, well-known and not so well-known. One of the signature pieces in the show is the tiny teapot that's just visible in the case in the front of the Cherished Possessions exhibition. It's an unprepossessing piece, but in fact has an incredibly remarkable story. This piece belonged to Crispus Attucks, who was the first martyr of the Boston Massacre. He's a man about whom very little is known. He was believed to have been of mixed Indian and African descent. He was enslaved, and in 1750 is written up in a notice about his escape from his family, William Brown, and is written up over a series of months, in fact, as not having returned yet. He next appears in the historical record in 1770 1770. In March 1770, things are becoming to come to a head between the British troops who are stationed in Boston and the colonials who are resentful of the troops that are stationed there. As John Adams later writes, any troop brought in to bring the peace is more likely to create two mobs where one was before. And in fact, tensions build during the winter of 69 and 70 and come to a head finally in March on a very snowy winter evening when crowds are drinking in pubs and complaining, and Crispus Attucks is one of them. And he eventually joins the crowd as it moves towards the customs house where the British sentries are posted. And they move on carrying clubs and banners and start taunting the sentry who's been taunted for months by this point. And he struggles, and eventually in his struggle reaches out and hits a young kid. And the crowd just goes berserk and yells, "Kill him, kill him, kill him," of the sentry, who's out there by himself. He yells for reinforcements, and the reinforcements come. In the meantime, Crispus Attucks, who's this extremely tall man, 6'2", very imposing, is standing in the front of the crowd. He's got a cudgel raised, and he's fighting for control of the weapon, and the weapon goes off. And in fact, by the time the shooting stops, 5 people are dead, Crispus Attucks being just one of them. Well, what happens is that the Patriots turn this to very good use. Within 3 weeks, Paul Revere's engraving of, quote, "The Bloody Massacre" is circulating up and down the colonies. And it shows not a mob action, but in fact a troop firing on a peaceful, unarmed citizenry, which is in fact nothing like what actually happened. But they're hugely successful. You know, when I was a kid, I heard about the Boston Massacre, and I thought that was when the British went too far. Well, in fact, the British didn't go too far, and the Patriots turned it to good cause, not only getting more and more support for their cause, but also effectively causing the troops to be withdrawn from the city. In the meantime, Crispus Attucks and his brother martyrs are all of them martyred together, but there's no discussion about Crispus Attucks's lineage. It's not the fact that he was a black man that gives him this martyr status. In fact, it's basically not mentioned other than his height and his imposing character. But 80 years later, the abolitionists start to use Crispus Attucks as a hero or as a martyr for their cause as well. And they start to rally around support for the building of a Crispus Attucks monument on Boston Common. And in fact, there's great resistance to it because there are people who understand that Crispus Attucks is a little bit of a dicey hero. He was, in fact, a mob ruffian. And so they're not successful initially about getting this monument built. But instead what they do is they create annual Crispus Attucks days to celebrate this black hero. And at the annual days, there are relics brought forth of both the Boston Massacre and of Crispus Attucks himself, including not only SPNEA's teapot, but this little teacup, which you see as well, which is also in SPNEA's collections. And these were seen as relics to a cause, and the cause now is abolitionism. Eventually, 30 years later, there is a monument built, but it's built in the face of strenuous objections on the part of xenophobic conservatives who argued that the monument would ennoble not only a black man, but others of foreign birth as well. In fact, the monument was put in 1888 and is still standing near the Park Square T-stop. The question about those two pieces, the teapot and the cup that you saw, is whether they actually ever did belong to Crispus Attucks. In fact, if Attucks escaped in 1750, never to return to his family, the likelihood that these would have been saved by the William Brown family, which is where they came from, is unlikely. However, if he did go back to the family and was still with them by 1770, then it's much more likely that things that belonged to him might have been preserved. Whether they actually belong to him or not, however, the story is to us just as rich because it tells the story of this growth of a relic, growth of a tradition that comes through the 19th century, during which there are a whole lot of political causes which create this new aura around Crispus Attucks, which is nothing like what he had in his own life. Another signature piece in the exhibition is this clock. This clock was written about by its owner in his diary in May 1777. He wrote, "I heard the clock every hour last night." May 1777 in York, Maine was a time of tremendous tension, as you can imagine. And Jonathan Sayward was at the heart of it. Sayward was a well-to-do merchant from York, Maine. It was his house that we were looking at earlier when we were looking at the 18th century house in SPNEA's collections. In the 1740s, he raised to heroic stature for his role in the siege of Louisburg. Now, Louisburg, as you may or may not know, was the equivalent of Cuba to us, in that it was the heart of the French encampment in Canada, from which the French Navy went out and interrupted shipping, English and colonial shipping along the New England coastline. And it always was sat there poised as a threat to New England's stability, and always seen as this fearful factor on the frontier. So in 1745, a group of New Englanders, along with English Navy, went up to Louisburg and laid siege to it and successfully subjugated it. And then in the treaty that occurred afterwards, the fort was remarkably given back to the French, and it wasn't until 10 years later that a second siege occurred, and the French were finally kicked out of Louisburg in Nova Scotia. But because of his role in effectively at least reducing the threat from the French, Sayward was highly honored and eventually elected to the General Court, where he did very well until 1768, when he was one of 17 rescinders who refused to sign a letter rescinding a letter that the General Court had sent out to the governments and the legislatures of the other colonies objecting to parliamentary colonial policies. And this letter was seen as by the governor as an act of treason. He demanded that the legislature write and bring the letter back. 92 refused to sign the letter. 17 signed it. Sayward was one, and he was reviled. Paul Revere gets involved again and circulates another print about all of the 17 on the gaping jaws of hell for their act of refusing to support this letter. But in fact, what I would argue is that Sayward was intensely loyal to his country being America. And as somebody involved in the siege of Louisburg only 20 years before, he could not imagine a country that would be safe without the protection of the British Navy. And even less could he imagine that the colonials would have any luck against the largest army and navy in the world. So by standing up against what was a very unpopular opinion, or taking a very unpopular stand, he was, in fact, I think, showing great bravery. And for his bravery, he was essentially imprisoned during the war. He was allowed to stay in his house, which many loyalists were not, but he was imprisoned. And he writes about how far he's gone down in his life and how once he was held up in esteem, and now he is faced with what he calls the scorn of abjects. Small wonder, then, that he was sleepless in 1777 on those long nights. The clock remains exactly where it was when Sayward heard it. It is in the corner of the sitting room. His winter bedchamber was down in the room next door to this, and in fact still remains attached by brackets to the wall. And in fact, as you can see, the clock was brought into this very small 18th century house and was too large for it. So the central finial was taken off and placed in a drawer nearby. And for the purposes of this exhibition, they were rejoined for the first time in 200 years. Another piece that speaks of the Revolution in New England is this desk and bookcase. But unlike Sayward's clock, this belonged to a patriot. This belonged to William Foster, who was a Boston merchant. and like many Boston merchants was a member of the Sons of Liberty. It was the Boston merchants who felt the pinch of British colonial policies first, and therefore, though they were wealthy and likely to be conservative, they were the ones who were most objecting to what they faced in the British, with the British Parliament. So as a member of the Sons of Liberty, William Foster was a man endangered after the battles of Lexington and Concord. And like many in Boston, when the British returned to the city, he left. And in fact, British General Gage, gave free passage to anyone who wanted to leave. And the reason for that was that he knew that soon the city would be under siege. This is before the fill-in of the Back Bay. The only access point to Boston is across a long neck reaching from what's now the South End to Roxbury. And it was a very easy location to lay siege to. So Gage, knowing this, realized that it was going to be very hard for him to feed not only his own soldiers, but also a populace as well, encouraged as many to leave as wanted to, and 14,000 left the city after the battles of Lexington and Concord. Gage was left with another 10,000, including his troops and those who remained behind that he had to feed. When William Foster left, he was fortunate enough to have a house in Brighton on the other side of the neck that he could retreat to, and he took many of his belongings with him. Gage said, whatever you want to take, you can take. But this desk and bookcase was too big. And like many who returned to Boston after the siege was over, after 1776, he found that his house was still intact, but his favored desk and bookcase was gone. And eventually it was discovered in the old Province House, which is where the British government was holding its court, its government. And he was asked by the then colonial government, who had taken over, to prove that it was his. And so he said, okay. And he pulled out a drawer onto which he had chalked his name, William Foster. And in fact, his name is chalked in something like 14 places on this desk and bookcase. And the reason that we know all this is that his granddaughter in the 19th century wrote the story of the desk and bookcases adventures during the siege of Boston and pasted it onto the inside of the prospect door. Now, this is another extremely humble object in the exhibition and in the catalog, but it's one of my favorites for telling, I think, a really rich story. This talks of the New England after the Revolution, of the days of the early Republic, which saw the birth of new industries, the economic expansion, and an increasingly prosperous populace. But there was a group that was left behind in this prosperity, and that group was the disabled. This little mug belonged to Charles Barrett, who lost his hearing after a high fever when he was 5. And he was a member of the inaugural class of the American Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb in Hartford, which was opened in 1817. And this school, the American Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb, was the first school in America for the disabled. It was founded by the Congregational minister, Thomas Gallaudet, who went to France to look for models and came back not just with models, but with one of the teachers from a French school for the deaf and dumb. And that teacher had a system of signing that he introduced to America and adapted for American idiom. And that system was what is now known as American Sign Language, and which is something like the 4th largest language spoken in America. It's considered a distinct language, and between 500,000 and 2 million people speak it as their primary language in this country. But in fact, before the introduction of this American Sign Language, people who were hearing disabled were unable to take part in any kind of world, in any kind of worldly life, because the only system they had for communicating was whatever they developed within their close circle of friends. And they could, of course, write, but sometimes, they had no way of knowing language even. So it wasn't until the development of American Sign Language, which came out of this American Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb, that this group became prosperous members of the community. And this school then served as a model not only for other asylums for the deaf and dumb in the country, but also for other schools for the disabled, and really started a trend which I think pulled in a group that was otherwise lost. Now, another group that had a hard time reaching the prosperity that was available in the new nation were people who did not have great connections. If you were connected, if your family were merchants, of course, you would have the type of connections that would enable you to succeed in whatever you wanted to try. But if you didn't have good connections, then you were stuck maybe trying to work in a more disreputable area, which is what Isaac Manchester did, who you see here. Isaac Manchester was a mariner who lived in Bristol, Rhode Island, and he teamed up with the DeWolf family of Bristol, who were the leading slave traders of the town. Slave trading was legal in the end of the 18th century, but starting to become illegal. States passed various laws making it illegal, but it wasn't until the federal government passed a law in 1807 outlawing it that slave trading went underground. It still continued amongst New England mariners, but went underground and was no longer legal. This man, Isaac Manchester, achieved great wealth as a slave trader, eventually buying his own ships, and was wealthy enough to buy a prosperous farm in Bristol and have his and his wife's portraits painted. But after the trade was abolished by the federal law, the Bristol and towns like it, particularly Newport, went into economic decline. And the DeWolf family, the central family in Bristol, eventually absconded in the 1820s to their Cuban sugar plantation and took with them many of the remaining bits of wealth of the town. And so Isaac Manchester, who had invested with the DeWolf family, lost everything, including his farm, his carriage, and an astonishing $80,000. And went from being a prosperous, well-to-do man to a common laborer. By the time he dies on the eve of the Civil War, he's listed not even as a mariner, but as a laborer, and was seen selling oysters around town, selling clams. So he had truly dropped to the lowest of the low. The remarkable thing is that he managed to hold on to this painting and to the one of his wife, for they passed down through his grandchildren to SPNEA. A victim of the slave trade is this man, Pedro Paris, who was captured in West Africa in the early 1840s and transported to Rio de Janeiro, where the ship on which he was transported was turned in by the sailors, because the sailors were American and they knew that this slave trade was illegal and apparently were horrified to find themselves transporting slaves. So they turned in their captain to the American consul in Rio de Janeiro, and the captured slaves or the captured Africans were taken out of the ship and sent to wherever it was that it would be safe. Pedro Paris and another young boy were transported to Boston, where they were expected to testify against the captain of the ship which had transported them to Rio de Janeiro. In fact, the captain of the ship put the trial on hold while he tried to gain evidence that, in fact, he just brought these boys over as servants but not as slaves. And a year after, the trial was closed for lack of evidence. In the meantime, Pedro had no place to go. His village was gone. His family was dispersed. And so he was taken by the U.S. Marshal of Maine to live with him and his family in Paris Hill, Maine. At some point, he does a watercolor that's an autobiographical piece that talks of what he remembers of his transport from Rio, which you see here. This is part of the watercolor showing a fort and the soldiers marching in Rio de Janeiro. And then the ship Raritan, which brought him from Rio to Boston. And then the hump that you see there is Beacon Hill, where he was brought with the State House on the top. And then finally, all the way on the far side is the farm on which he grew up in Paris, Maine. As you can imagine, he was a celebrity in Paris, Maine, probably the only black person anyone there had ever seen, and so lived a fairly good life, although he died young. He died within 10 years, probably around the age of 30, as many Africans did when they were brought to New England. The cold weather was something that their constitution simply could not handle, which is really one of the reasons that slavery did not do well in New England. It was simply not economically viable. So Paris dies fairly young, but in the meantime, he records his story in this watercolor. He also tells it to the young son of the Paris family, who later, 30 or 40 years later, writes down what he remembers of Pedro's story, including the story of his capture from his village, when he remembers the last thing he saw was his grandmother screaming to try and get him back. But also songs that he sung to the young boy, and the boy recorded them and wrote them out phonetically, and those papers still exist. Now, as I know you know, as New England was the home of a very strong abolitionist voice, and this quilt appears in the Liberator, the abolitionist newspaper of New England, in January 2, 1837, when it's described along with other things sold at a recent anti-slavery fair. The Liberator writes of, quote, a cradle quilt made of patchwork in small stars, and on the central star was written, Mother, when around your child you clasp your arms in love, and when with grateful joy you raise your eyes to God above, think of the Negro woman. When her child is torn away, sold for a little slave, oh then for that poor mother pray. The abolitionist movement was widespread by the time this was sold in the 1830s. Women played a very important role in the movement, particularly through the development of these anti-slavery fairs, which began around 1835. Women used their skills as sewers to supply objects for sale. And the objects for sale were not only like this quilt that carried with them some mark of abolitionism, but also the goal of the abolition fair was simply to raise awareness so that people might come to see the fair out of curiosity, but they would go away with an understanding of the position of the anti-slavery group. Women had been accustomed to gathering together to sew for just simply community purposes, but this was the first time that they really they began to combine sewing with activism, and it was eye-opening for them. So while they were sitting around together sewing these pieces for the slavery fair, they were also learning about organizing big events. They were also honing their speaking abilities as they spoke to the converted, their other friends, about this heinous condition in their country that they wanted to change. And as a result, they became more and more activists and more outspoken, and women began to travel from these sewing circles to speak on a national level. They began to deal with nationally important abolitionists, men and women, to bring in speakers, and they became targets. Because while we know a lot about the abolitionists in New England, the thing that we forget is the New England economy was as much based on Southern cotton as the Southern economy was. That it was Southern cotton that filled the New England textile mills, and it was Southern cotton that filled the hold of New England ships that went from the South to New England and over to England. So therefore, it was seen with great fear, the abolitionist movement, as a group of quacks trying to change something that would eventually change of its own volition. As soon as the cotton gin was invented, I think the feeling was that eventually slavery would die its own death, but that wasn't enough for these women. So they became extremely active and extremely reviled, and in that began to sort of understand their role and bridle at their role in America. And so they became increasingly activists not only in the abolition movement, but also in the growing women's movement. And in fact, the owner of this quilt eventually ended up giving a tremendous amount of money in his will to Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone, quote, to secure the passage of laws granting women, whether married or unmarried, the right to vote, to hold office, to hold, manage, and devise property, and all other critical rights enjoyed by men. So there's a direct link, in New England at least, between the abolition movement and the women's movement, which grew in strength after the end of the Civil War and was supported by men and women alike who'd been involved in abolitionism. Now, eventually the Civil War broke out, inevitably, as we think now, but as they thought as well. It was written about as an inevitable thing that would happen from the 1730s, from the 1830s on. And while we think of families in the border states as being the most divided by the conflict, in fact, families as far away as Maine were equally divided. This is Arthur Macarthur of Lymington, Maine, in a painting that was painted around 1836 and was one of 5 paintings of Arthur Macarthur and his family. And in fact, the story of their family 30 years after this is painted is a story of great tragedy. The oldest son, Arthur Jr., becomes a lawyer like his father and moves first to St. Louis and then south to ply his legal trade and becomes completely enamored of the South. And he writes to his family about how outrageous it is that people from the North are coming down to the South and telling Southerners how to live, that in fact that's completely unacceptable. He also writes to his family that it's quite clear to him that once the South separates from the North, they will rise to become the most powerful nation on earth, that their connections with South America, with Cuba, with Mexico, and their incredibly rich plantation soil will bring them the type of wealth that will create this world power. As he writes back to his family, his sister, after the war breaks out, is fearful for his life. She writes about him as an ennobled but mistaken youth, and she tries to scheme ways to get letters across to him. And in fact, what she doesn't know is that he's already been killed. He's killed in an early skirmish in Virginia. The next younger brother, William, in the meantime, has been recruiting soldiers and then fighting for the North, and eventually succeeds as an officer so well that he is raised to the level of brigadier general by the end of the war. In fact, William goes on to survive the post-war years particularly well as a lawyer, like his brother was and his father was, but eventually he wins the Louisiana State Lottery and is able to retire from the legal business and continues to raise an orchard and own the house in which these paintings were painted and hung until his death in the early 20th century. Now, like so many of the objects in this exhibition and in the catalog, this one takes us to an unexpected place. When this piece showed up in one of our houses in Wiscasset, Maine, I assumed it was the product of collecting, as many Navajo rugs came back to New England from people who were collecting. But in fact, it's much more than that. The woman on the back seat on the left is Jane Tucker, who was an intrepid woman of Wiscasset, Maine. She was a saleswoman who traveled for McCall's pattern books around the East and the Midwest, selling these patterns, traveling by train, finding herself not succeeding the way her male cohorts were, and complaining about it in letters back home. Her family, which had great wealth in the middle of the 19th century, has gone bust because they've contributed to a train that ran through Wiscasset that, in fact, took the wealth of most well-to-do people in town. And so she's had to contribute to the family wealth whatever way she can. One way she does it after she stops working as a saleswoman is she tries to teach ceramic painting and embroidery, but finds that she has very little business. So instead what she does, and this is the unexpected part of that Navajo rug, is she goes out west to stake a claim and writes back to her family about her travels through Wyoming and finding a piece of land that she thinks will do well for them, and staying in cabins on the floor and sleeping under one of 2 Navajo rugs that she's brought for the purpose. And then she writes and says that she thinks they'll look very well on the floor of the piazza when she sends them back. So the Navajo rugs here were collected for actual use, but also tell this unusual story of the role of women in the end of the 19th century, a role people that we don't know much about, but that in fact I think is more true than not. Another group of very interesting women are the women of the Saturday Evening Girls Pottery. This is a social experiment that was remarkably successful, that was done by women for women. And it was an outgrowth of a reading group called the Saturday Evening Girls, who were a group of immigrant Jewish and Italian women who lived in Boston's North End and who wanted to improve themselves. And so they got together of their own volition on Saturday evenings, eventually ended up in the North End Branch Library, meeting on a weekly basis, and somebody read to them, and then they would discuss it, same as reading groups today. But in fact, it was very hard for them to get away, and the philanthropist Helen Storrow saw this and decided that she wanted to help them. So she hired a couple of women who were trained at the museum school to help them. And what these women decided was that, this is the period of the arts and crafts, she could give them a craft that would be a way for them to make money. And so what she did was what these two women did was form a pottery in the basement of a building that was just under the Old North Church, which is what gives the pottery its name, the Paul Revere pottery. And she would train them in decorating. She brought in a man who was a modeler, and then continued to have these women be read to. So their old Saturday Evening Girls reading group continued into the pottery, but in the meantime they're paid for their decorating. Those who want to volunteer can help by sweeping and by shipping, and the pottery is socially extremely successful, so much so that where most women in this period, most immigrant children, do not go to high school. 75% of this group graduated from high school. Another 50% took college and professional classes, and they eventually did very well for themselves, which I think is a direct result of this support that they got in this reading group. And aside from that, they created some incredibly beautiful pottery, which is now harder and harder to find on the market. And that is a quick run through a number of objects from SPNEA's collections. The exhibition has now closed. It opened in Maine in July and ran through the end of October. It's on hiatus until next summer when it travels to Texas to the Amon Carter Museum. It goes from there to Honolulu, and then we'll come back east and be in New York City at the Bard Graduate School, and from there travels to Michigan. But in the meantime, there's a catalog, which I have an example of, which you're welcome to come up and look at. And there will be 2 more talks on the subject later this month. And now are there questions? Yeah. The question is the exhibit going to be anywhere in the greater Boston area? And I'm sorry to tell you that it's not. We have tried very hard to get it into a Boston venue, but through scheduling conflicts or for whatever reason, we have had no luck getting it here. We're still working on one more place, and with any luck, we'll get it closer to home if we can. But at the moment, its closest spot is New York. All the objects are from SPNEA, and they'll all come back, yes, eventually. Some of them have been taken out of the houses, so if you go, for instance, to the Sayward Wheeler house over the next couple years, you'll see a few holes. But it's an opportunity for these objects to be seen by more people than they would be seen at the Sayward Wheeler house. Yep. The question is, does SPNEA have much of this pottery? We have a fair bit of it, by which I would guess about 20 pieces. We had more, but it's one of the few examples of theft which occurred years ago. These were on display in the Otis House and were stolen before my time in the 60s. You know, it's known, and I can look it up in the book. One of them is signed and the other one not. And one of them, I think it's the bowl, is by Sarah Gallin. Does that sound? Gallner, that's right, Gallner. But it may be the vase that's Sarah Gallner. No! Oh, she's her daughter-in-law. How exciting. Oh, that's so great. Oh, isn't that great? Well, there are later Paul Revere pottery pieces that are not as beautifully made as the early ones. And the early ones have incised lines around them. And in fact, am I right in thinking that Sarah Gellner is here? She's not in that picture. Okay. You've had a question, yeah. You know, it's really interesting to look at things from the 1820s because sometimes they're so bizarre, they look incredibly modern. So there was this kind of wacky aesthetic of the beginning of the 19th century that's mirrored in also the wacky aesthetic of the early 20th century, the sort of Art Deco period, but then also in some modern things. But that's about an 1820 piece out of England and is one of a zillion little children's mugs that were made in that period for gifts for children. Yeah.
I was wondering, the designs on this pottery, was that something that someone told them to do a certain way, or did they just create it on their own mind?
Well, it's the case that this pottery has a limited number of designs. So my guess is that there was somebody, and it could well have been the girls who were doing the decoration, who took the lead on creating the designs that would be part of the Paul Revere pottery. But whether they certainly weren't importing the designs. The designs are unique to the Paul Revere pottery group. Does that answer your question, do you think? All right, thank you very much.